Anyway, I mean, not that there is that's not Khalila. What I mean is that could be the one word for it. Alright, so we got down to the Indian from Rotsover, Roshoy, and we saw that the Indian, the Amitis Indian and Rotsoy, is if we took the Moshel of Makshova, how we had it in the mind of Shmini Atzeres, and we're going to see that's connected with the Indian from Rotsoy, and like we saw Makshova and Rotsoy. Madrege Achas and Indian Echod B'Pnimiusan. And we saw there's the Indian from Makshova, how it is mitzad Koyach HaMakshova. Do we learn that sentence? Koyach HaMakshova in the brackets at the end of the point, at the end of the page.
Yes.
We didn't get that far?
No, we're in Mem Gimel.
Yeah, we're over on Mem Gimel. What do you mean we didn't get that far? We didn't learn at the bottom of Mem Base?
We did.
Yeah, sure we did. Yeah. So we're over on Mem Gimel because we saw that there are different stages in the Indian from Makshova. There's the Koyach HaMakshova, that's how it's called in its Makir. And then we saw there's a Gilui HaMakshova in a certain Metzias. And then there's a third level. That's what we saw in the mind of Shmini Atzeres. That in these Inyonim there's Gimel Bechinas or Gimel stages in the Indian of Gilui. And we saw that the ultimate Gilui is when the Oisius are Mugoshes, when the Oisius are to be felt, and the governing power is already the Koyach HaGbola in the Oisius, which limits his Makshova into ordered sentences and we saw over the Barichas. So the Indian of Rotzoy is that in the Oiros, how they come out of their Makir, and they're eventually mislavish in the Kalim, because in that regard, Oisius for Kalim have a similar Nakudo, they are basically the same meaning. And once the Oiros are already Mishyachid, Slavish, in the Kalim, well then it's Shayat the Indian of Rotzoy, because due to the fact that the Yoya feels the Hagbola placed on it through the Indian of the Kli, yeah, the Kli is Magna, well then it feels this Rotzoy, this genuine Rotzim, to go back and to be Mishkalel in its Moker, al Yedei, that it's Yoitzim in a Kli. In other words, there are two inyanim in the Rotzoy. The first is the desire to get out of the Hagbola, the feeling of the limitation, al Yedei Kli, and then the inyan of Iskalelus, take its mocker. That's like what you might call the final realization of the Rotzoy. So we saw B'shah She'yeta, the Ayin, and we're holding on Mem Gimel, that's already on the second line. B'shah She'yeta, Adayin Hu B'chli, Hu B'chinas Nifra, Me'achar She'hu Rotz, Ve'eich Shayach Merutza, לאחר יציאתו מן הגבול שנכלל במקורו, כי אם כאשר הוא ככלי ומרוחק ממקורו, מה שייך הרצוי? So we saw that in the Daki when he's mugbal still through the union of the Keli, and that Keli causes a pirud between him and his Mokkeh, nifrat, meaning that he's separated from the Mokkeh. Then it's Shayach from Rotz, and as we pointed out, that the word Rotzoy is built from two basic root words, both of them which ultimately really link together in their final pshat. Rotz meaning to run, and Rotzon, the idea will. Yeah. So when you run towards something, when you have a will, the meaning from will causes a swift movement on the part of the willer. And once he wants it, then he's anxious to gain what it is that he wants. So the Indian from Rotzoy is like, as we saw at the beginning when we touched it, a continuous participial usage of the two words, Rotzain and Rotz. So when is a child that he's Rotz, that he's running? Well, that's the word Mu'utze. Mu'utze means a running. Like an absolute noun of the word Ratz. That Shayat Daki when he's in the Kli, because once he's left the Kli, then automatically, once he's left the Kli, then he becomes Niklal Bim Koiroi. And once he's Niklal Bim Koiroi, then that's the result of the Rotzoi, or that's its final fulfillment. That's not the Rotzoi itself. Kiim Kasheru B'Kli. When he's in the Keli, then it's Shayach the Inyan of Rotzoi. Why? Because he's Maruchak Mim Koiroi. He feels the distance. Because the Kli causes an Inyan from feeling of distance. All Shayach HaRotzoi, then it's Shayach this whole concept of Rotzoi. V'klolos Inyan HaRotzoi, hu b'pinas Histalkius. Now the Rebbe said it follows that we're now able to sum up what is the generality of Rotzoi in Histalkus. Now Histalkus means the word L'Stalik. L'Stalik means to go upwards in its simple type. And the word L'Salik can even mean to get rid of something. You know, you can talk about L'Salik Avanim, to move away the stones from a path. That nature. In other words, the basic word "select" means to make something alter its place, to change its place, to move it, shift it. Histalkus is a absolute noun after we've turned the verb into a what you call reflexive. It goes back to the verb. The histalek here means to move yourself. But normally it means to move yourself in the idea of going upwards. In the Ruchnistic impression, it means more the concept of going upwards. And therefore, Histalkus, here with the Vav Tov at the end, is an absolute noun, meaning withdraw upwardly. How do you call it? Well, I don't think I have it anymore in my room. I can't even remember what I got in my room anymore. But I used to have in the other old room, I used to have on the door. We once had a poster for the yeshiva. It was made by a guy in South Africa. It was written in big letters, "Do you want to be upwardly mobile?" Did you ever see that poster? I might have...
it's still in your office, isn't it?
I think it's somewhere in my office. I don't know where it is. I think it's rolled up and put in one of the cupboards or something. But we still have a few copies of it somewhere, I think. It was a very brilliant, how do you call it, a man of advertisement, a publicity man in South Africa. But just by the way, he was the one who made the big campaign for Mandela when he came out of prison for the ANC, for the National Council, what they were the revolutionary blacks that they elected to go to the government. He was in charge of the whole campaign. He's a year. But anyway, he was in charge of the whole campaign. As he wrote us this poster, he made us this poster. So I knew him very well. I don't know him so well now, but I used to know him in those days. Anyway, you know, he goes, what's his name? Gavin. Connie, you remember Connie? Yeah, he's his son.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, Connie's his son. Connie Gavin. So anyway, this guy, he wrote, you remember him, yeah? Yeah. So he wrote us a thing that was written, you have to be upwardly mobile. Now that's what Rotzoi means, exactly that. What it means is you're mobile. In other words, you're moving away from where you are, but you're going outward and upward. That's the concept of Rotzoi, and that's the concept of Histalkus. So what it follows is then that how would you call it, the summing up in absolute language of Rotzoi is Histalkus. Upwardly mobile, that's exactly the word. Going up and up and away, but the Ika is feeling of the away from the limitation where you are, and the ultimate fulfillment is going to be when you reach. But that's not really concerning him at the moment where he's going to reach. What is concerning him at the moment is the getting out, and that's because he has a picture and a tainug in what he's going to reach. But at the beginning, that's what I would say, that the whole thing of the beginning of a rotzi when he's still in the kli. Once he's got out of the kli, then in Ruchnias these things don't float through the air for a certain amount of time or something. Once he's out of the kli, then he'll be nidbak in whichever madrega his rotzi involved. So the whole concept of rotzi, which is desire to get out of something that's holding you back, is in the kli. The ultimate revelation, the ultimate fulfillment of the rotzi, that's a later stage when you already become nichlal. Then you don't really feel the rotzi anymore, because once you're nichlal, then you lose your homer machias in the madrega elyon, to which you were, and therefore we saw that the rotzi is so complete that once the oil is mistalik into the mocker, then it's a new oil that comes out altogether, because that oil just loses its whole soul. And if you look in Perek Yutes in Tanya, it's very meduya. The Alter Rebbe says over there that the neshama has in itself the union of teva, to go upwards, teva ha'aliyah. He said over there, but that's mitzad the fact that it's a ne'er Hashem nishmas odom. And he brings over there that the teva ha'eish is to be oil klapi maila. And he says, afopi yesh kasher, once you reach the Yisod Aish HaMakrida, that she's longing for the fire, Tishoya Mimohusa Vatzmusa Harisha Miyuma. Nothing will remain of her original Metzias at all. She will just be completely lost in the Makkah. Afu Pikain, Cain, he writes of her Petiva. Afu Pikain, that's what the Neshama wants. In other words, the Neshama doesn't want Metzias. The Neshama wants to be Oish Metzias. And nothing will remain of her original material. And yet that's what she wants. The etzim nekuda, the neshama yita. So we see that the whole union of a neshama is ois material. And therefore that's why the neshamas are to be poiled by a yid, all sorts of strange inyonim. It can even be poiled by him that he sit in a place like that. But to me, when they tell him these inyonim the whole time, unless he even enjoys it. Well, we hope he does, because that's the whole union of a neshama. That's what the Rebbe means. Once you've gone and you've been nichlal, that's not really the rotz anymore, because then you're bye-bye. We don't know about you anymore. You've gone into a zamadrega, and only the Eibishter knows whence you have reached. What's going to be with the oil? It's in the keli. Another oil will come out. Another chadat, like we saw. It's a new oil altogether. And there was the Rebbe, the Ike Indian, and the Rotzai is a stalkus. I'm going upwards, upwardly mobile, upward movement. That's Rotzai. So therefore they said the Rebbe, the Achidus, the Legabi Akli, Vadi Rupchidus is stalkus. As far as the Kli is concerned, before the Rotzai there was a yichud between the Ur and the Kli. Now the Ur goes up, the Ur has become upwardly mobile, and therefore the Kli feels the lack of the Ur, and therefore the Kli feels that that's a union for Nishtalki. Legabei HaKli, it's Vadai Hu Ishtalki, even though that sometimes when even the Kalim go up, and they also get the union of Ratzai, and that's on Erev Shabbos when everything goes up, and then even the Kalim go up. But normally the union of the Kli Kilu doesn't experience the Ratzai. Therefore, the Gabi the Kli, it's a Histalkif, meaning that the Oyer has been Histalkif. Oh no. Ubchinis Histalkif, the Gabi Ho'er Gamke. This is the Chiddush. The Rebbe says that it's also a concept of Histalkif, also the Gabi the Oyer. Now, what does the Rebbe mean? What he means here is that the Oyer, has got two different stages. And the Oyer is going to be leaving one aspect of itself, as it were, behind and going away to another aspect. So even the Oyer literally experiences a relationship in itself of how it is, the Gabi the Histalkus of the Oyer. In other words, not that you've got a Kli, and the Kli sees that there's been no Histalkus, because it loses the Oyer, as it were. He said even the Oyer is going to be like a part of the Oyer which remains not so much involved in the Rotzai at the beginning. And it could be that later when the oil has gone upwards, that it draws everything with it. But he said it's also shot to talk about a static aspect of the oil and a portion of the oil which is Ba'aliyah Ubi Stalkers. That was it, the Rebbe finished over here, that even like the oil, the Indian is also Istalkers. In other words, that Istalkers implies two entities. There's one thing which is going away and that which is left behind. If nothing's left behind, then it's hard to talk about Istalker. Because where's it been mistalek from? But so by a Kegli, then Bavadai said that fits. But he said even like the oil, it also fits. How does that fit? So he says, the Meyachashem Islavish Bakli, once the oil has come down and entered these slabshins, then it's become distant from its etem. Etem meaning the mocha of the earth. It's already another type of entity. It's another mahus, another entity, how do you call it, another essence in itself, but Gabi what it was. He says, Daharei, is Galuso, Harihu Nasib, is Metzias Oya, Obefrat Agavon, Shanasa Boy, Alida Akli. Yeah, the Mishum Zeh, Ubchinas, Mohus, Nifrat, Kanahar. Be'im Kain, Beharot, so Ubchinas, Istalkis, Mimahus Lema. Remember, it's a very fascinating idea. Once the oil comes down and the oil enters the kli, then it takes on two inyanim. First of all, it becomes a inyan for gilu, until it's so much a gilu that they'll enter the kli, which is the makabel. So he said the oil which has gone out to gilu has already become what we call metzius oil. Because as we explained on numerous occasions, the oil out cold inside the moya is not only for Matthias because it's the moya. It's not called in the name of a Shem oil of the cloud. It's called a moya, even though it's there. The truth is that the oil is also called inside the moya. But in that madrega, as the Alter Rebbe Masbe in Perek Gimel, in Shara Yichud V'Amunah, the way the oil is b'toich hamoya, ain't b'finis Matthias v'eino oil b'Shem klal. In other words, on a much higher madrega. I explained the other night, that's one of the tamim for the whole Aliyah Shavuot, the whole Inyan from Otzer. It comes to the fact that the way it was B'toich HaMoed is on a much higher madrega. And therefore, that once that goes out and it becomes a Inyan for Niskalus, it reveals itself into a state outside its Niskalus in the Moya, then it's already become a Matthias. So then we say, oh, this is a oil. It's like we see that if we take the moshel of the shemesh, that once the oil leaves the shemesh, and it's mayor into what we call the halal, or ilam as he calls it over there, into space, then it becomes a noticeable oil, or the way it's inside the shemesh, you can't really distinguish it as an oil. And therefore it changes it in that regard, that it becomes what we call a machius. It becomes already an entity which we call oil. And the way it was inside the etem tzarada. And there was that's one nakuda that this gilui implies matziyah. Ubefrat, and particularly if we take the effect of the keli on the earth. But you remember earlier we learned the famous diuk b'shem Pardes. But the Pardes said that the keli has an effect on the earth, not be etzem pnimis v'atzmis. It doesn't actually change the earth. The etzem minyoneh, but it's al derech. If you put mayim shutim inside a colored kli, then the mayim take on the color of the kli. That's what it means by the word gavon. Because gavon means like a shade of color. Among the kelim have an effect on the kli that alchol ponim be shechanius. The keli affects the kli, the oil, and the oil becomes our oil, which is lefi that kli. Therefore, it's got a certain color of the kli. Well, that's it even further. You read into me. Therefore, said the Rebbe, as far as if he said that if you came, the verse of the Chanasa, the Mishum Zer, who is Mohus Nifrad, And therefore the oil becomes, as it were, a mahus nifrad. It becomes like a separate mahus compared to its etzem from whence it came. So we've got two stages. First of all, the etzem is galas, bichutz lemoya, and then the etzem entry into the kedim and the effect of the kli on the that makes the what we call a uniform mahus nifrad. Even though oil can never become nifrad like kedim, of upon him when he gets his previous mahus, then it's uniform mahus nifrad.
When the oil leaves the cave and goes into the second cave, right? And then when it goes as
not second cave,
okay.
First.
Right, okay. But as soon as like you said, as analogies to the drop of oil. But as soon as the drop of oil leaves a glass or something like that, it becomes a material on its own before it's dropped. Into something else.
That's a good point. But that's already talking about a slightly different idea. And that means that when the oil, when the drop becomes like a drop, it becomes like a separate entity altogether. So it cheers in its own way. Well, that's a moshel for another idea. That's more a moshel for the idea of the kelim rather than the oil mix. The idea of a separate drop, well, that's a moshel for another type of amshocha. Here the oil always remains completely muted with the moya. And the oil betachas hayichud im moya cannot really be separate. It cannot become like a separate drop. The union of the separate drop, that's more a union of the shabbos of the yesh, in other words, beyond. Well, even though it's really from the water, but it's a drop. It doesn't become separated out. But that's a slightly different idea.
Right.
Here we're talking about the very fact that it goes up and that high beetle, which was inside these colors, when it was in the etzem, the very fact that it moves out into a form where it's, as it were, noticeable, that only gives it the getter of mitzvah. I mean, I understand your reasoning, but it's not exactly meduya for this whole area. Amamela said the Rebbe, it follows the piece here, that these two tamim, even the oil has become a mahus nifrad. When it does this rotzoi, it's also, as it were, going out of itself, leaving behind a state in itself in order to go to a higher state. In other words, it's very similar to the kli. Just when it leaves the kli, it leaves the kli because the kli is a separate entity, and it wants to go back. And when it leaves its own self, as it were, now, it's also leaving, as it were, a certain aspect of which it was in order to go to the state of Ishkalas B'Tega Etzer. But it's also a union from the Ishkalas Mahus L'Mahus. V'hainu L'Mahus Dor She'ena Be'erakoi. It means it's going up now to a new Mahus, which is not in its own erech. It's not in its own comparison, how do you call it, comparable entity. She'ena Be'erak. It's completely incomparable to it. Harizeh B'chinas Aliyah. It's also a union literally going upwards. Ne'atak means to be literally altered away from. It's not a union from klal, a mahus klal according to the erechot of the way the oil is now. To a certain extent, the oil is also leaving behind part of its own self. In other words, it's also going from a state which it wants to leave behind, and it's not just that it's going from Moishehu in a state of Ishtal. It therefore fits into the whole general pattern of the word Ishtalkus, which means to leave behind a state where you are. So, we have to assume that ultimately that Ishtalkus is also poil in the oil that's left in the kli, as it were, coming off. Also, these stuff. Ultimately, the clovis oil joins into the Indian arot, but in that respect is different than the moshel and the keli. The keli doesn't join the rotza necessarily, even though there is a certain rotza feel in the keli. But that's another reason. So we have to say that ultimately the whole b'china of the oil enters the rotza. But at the beginning, it's like a movement from mahus to mahus. Sure. And I mean, that's the whole concept then of rotzoi, Rotz is only sharp hamshocha b'finas richuk. Once it becomes Maroche, then it wants to go back, and it's Shaykh Alidei what there's a unity with another Mahus, Al-Kaponim Iro, another Mahus like a Kli, or a unity with its own self, as it were, in a new type of Mahus, and therefore a movement back from that Mahus to the Mahus of these colors inside the Eter. Mashen Kain says that's the union of that's like a summing up of the whole concept of Rotzim. Mashen Kain in a Shurish Mokia Chayas Shalo Elamed. If we take the Shurish Mokia of the whole Chayas of the Elamed, that's the etzem of this oil. That's the etzem of Gabi this oil. She'ena b'finas maruz klar. I'm sorry. Shalo Elamed. Bereshis Hamshachosai. Hainu b'finas harotzain. She'ena nimshut kol kach. Liyesh b'finas richuk. B'finas nifrat. Klal kanal. Hurat b'finas reshis hamshocha. Min hamoker. B'finas helem. Adayin. Shuminis iskalas. Be'amoker adayin. Lo yishayek poi inin hamorutza. Me'acher shaloi nisvachek klal. So the Rebbe said Mashekim, which is not the case. You remember we started our sentence earlier that in the Rotzen Shebachol Olam, that's higher than the Ingen of Zman. In other words, it's higher than Rotzen Vashoy, beyond the Ingen of so the same thing here. We're now dealing in more detail with the Ingen of Rotzen. And we saw earlier in the Maimah of Shmini Atzeret, and even hinted at also in the Maimah prior to that, we saw that the Indian of Rotzain is not a Mahus Nifrad Mi'aetz. We saw it's an Indian of Hamshocha, or what we call Hatoyas Aetz.
What's Hatoyas? Sorry, it's not
Ratzon,
right.
Will. Even though we have to say that the Indian of will is we saw the difference between will, Rotzen, and Tainu is that the Rotzen is Dafke Nimshach Ledvorim Musiyomim. That's the whole difference between Rotzen and Tainu. The Tainu is not Nimshach. Tainu is to be oil of a Mistabik. Nonetheless, we have to say, or rather, Lafiza, we have to say, that there's a certain Indian in Rotzen which is Hamshocha. Albeit it's Hamshocha Atzmiyas, but it is a certain, because the Indian of Rotzen is to go towards what the will determines that we want. However, if we take the Atzmus of the Eibush, the Mamish, in Atzmus is Muda, Mikol Gilui Ha'elos, right? We have to say that the Rotzain is nonetheless some form of Hamshocha, albeit it's Hamshocha in a very high level, but it's some form of Hamshocha, it's some form, and therefore it must be some form of Ha'ora, because the Etzem itself is not Nimshach. And therefore we have to, that's what we saw before, that the Indian from Rotzon, will, is what we call Hatoyas Ha'etzem. A Hamshocha of the Etzem, or a Sof it is a Hamshocha. That was the Rebbe, it's a form of Ha'ora, but it's a Ha'ora which is Kol B'Ha'etzem. So wherever you have Rotzim being Mizkale, what you're really having is a Ha'ora Atzmiyas, not Stama Ha'ora, which is a Gilui of the Etzem, and it's Nimshach of the Manas, that certain Inyonim should be carried out. Not that it does them, it remains within its Makim, Aleihem. That's what the Rebbe means, that the Reishis Hamshocha Min HaMokeh, Finas Helem, that's what he means. And he said that the Rotzen is Nimshach, but it's not Nimshach in a way that it becomes Richuk, or Finas Pirut. It's only the Inifan Hamshocha Min HaMokeh Finas Helem. Helem meaning the Gabi, all the Protim which later come out in the form of the media through which we eventually carry out what the Rotzen want. And ever we call Pavinisis colorless Biamokia Adayin. When we mean Adayin, it always remains that way. Adain means for the time being. We mean Lagabi, all the other inyanim which Rotzen later demands come out. Therefore, shayat by Inyan Hamurutza, it's not shayat that it should want to run back into itself. Murutza meaning the idea of the running back. Miyacha Shalei Nisrachik. Mamela, therefore, we can't really say this ha'ora which is rotten. Now, why does the Rebbe want to warn this? I mean, what is Petlal, the whole shaila behind this whole piece? We said before, when we were explaining the Teva Aliyah Ba'oyah, that Oya has this Teva to be Oyle, Lim Koiroi, where does that derive from? From the fact that Oya is only a ha'ora. And anything which is a ha'ora wants to go back and be niklal in its mocket. And if we're saying that the rotzen is also now a ha'ora of some form of chokra, then it also should have the Indian from rotzoi. It should also have this Indian of Oya which is being nisrachik and wanting to go back. What the Rebbe says, the Indian from rotzen is a form of amshocha, but it's a form of amshocha, like we pointed out before, an achmi, in the way that it's not shy to say that it ever becomes misrachik, it ever goes away in a distance, and it's never mislavish in a kli. Therefore, it's always based colorless in its mokkeh, in its etem, and it's not shy to say that it ever became distant. Yeah, ain't a misrachik. And therefore, since ain't a misrachik, ain't a time brings Morus u'Machias acher. It doesn't ever become a new and other Machias. In Cain, enu shai poya rots oi. Yeah? Ela, mashe nimshach kitzas. It's only nimshach a bit. Now the word kitzas meaning that there is a hatoya, like we call it. Yeah, like a pronus or a leaning from the rotzen. But that's not called ha'ora and hamshochas ha'ora in the normal sense. It's called a sort of hamshoch kitzas. And therefore automatically almost without wanting to go back, it just automatically goes back and is nikla. In other words, that the rotzen the whole time has to always be mishchadish also. And on the contrary, in a way we're going to say eventually, that's what's mashma of them has hemshel of samachay that he brought down. That the chiddush in the union of the rotzen is greater than the chiddush in other, the ischadshus in the mokkeh is greater because the rotzen is a very, very high closeness to the mokkeh, and therefore it senses the ein arech of the mokkeh, as it were, and therefore the newness in that reappearance is much greater mitzad its own how do you call it quality, but it's not an inyan of rotzoi v'shoy. But it's an inyan, says the Rebbe, it's an inyan shenimshach tzas u'mamela choizer v'nikla. The whole oyer shel b'chinas hamshocha mamela hu gam b'chinas iskal. So that's a cloud. It doesn't matter on what madrega we talk. Any form of oyer, whether it be a atzmi like here, or it be mamisha ha'ora like we talked later, he said it's in a state of hamshocha mamela with just on its own, without its own self, who gam came b'chinas iskalos, iskalos meaning going back into the mokkeh. He said, Hine zeh nikra b'chinas